When my stepson looked at me with a gaze that lingered just a moment too long, I knew something had shifted between us. How did we let the lines blur so much? What happens when quiet moments of connection threaten to upend everything we've built? Before we dive into this emotionally charged and unforgettable story, make sure to subscribe to my channel for more captivating tales like this one, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you. When my stepson leaned in close, brushing my shoulder as he reached for the coffee mug, I felt the air between us shift, something unspoken yet undeniable. It wasn't the first time I had noticed these moments, fleeting yet potent, but it was the first time I didn't know how to react. My husband, Dan, was gone again. Another business trip that would keep him away for weeks. He had been working tirelessly to secure a promotion, and while I admired his drive, it left a hole in our home. Loneliness had become a constant companion, filling the quiet spaces Dan once occupied. That morning, the house felt particularly still, the hum of the fridge and the faint chirping of birds outside the only sounds as I prepared breakfast. Nathan, my stepson, shuffled into the kitchen, his usual tousled hair and sleepy demeanor giving him a boyish charm despite his 22 years. "Morning," he muttered, his voice gravelly from sleep. "Morning," I replied, smiling as I handed him a plate of eggs. He sat at the counter, eating in silence as the sunlight streamed through the window, painting golden streaks on the hardwood floor. We hadn't always been close. When Dan and I married 5 years ago, Nathan had been aloof, keeping his distance as if unsure of my place in his world. But over the years, we had found common ground. Shared jokes, movie nights, and long talks when Dan was away. It wasn't the same as a biological parent-child relationship, but it was enough to feel like family. At least that's what I told myself. "Plans for today?" I asked, trying to fill the silence. He shrugged. "Not really. Thought I'd stick around, maybe help out if you need it." His answer surprised me. Nathan was usually out with friends or working on his car. The offer to help seemed out of character, but I welcomed the company. "Sure," I said. I was thinking of reorganizing the pantry, could use some muscle for the top shelves. He smirked, taking a sip of his coffee. "Sounds thrilling." As the day wore on, we settled into a rhythm, emptying the pantry and wiping down shelves. The task was mundane, but Nathan's dry humor kept the mood light. "You really kept this?" he asked, holding up a faded recipe book. I laughed. "That's vintage, don't you dare throw it out." He chuckled, shaking his head as he placed it on the counter. "Whatever you say, boss." At one point, I climbed onto a step stool to reach the higher shelves, feeling his hand steadying the stool as I wobbled slightly. "Careful," he said, his voice close. Thank," I murmured, my heart skipping for reasons I couldn't quite name. By late afternoon, we had finished the pantry and moved on to other chores. The familiarity of working together had lulled me into a sense of ease, but a small part of me couldn't shake the lingering awareness of his presence. As I stood in the living room folding laundry, he joined me on the couch, his arm brushing against mine as he reached for a shirt. "I don't know how Dad does this alone," he said, his tone reflective. "What do you mean? Being away so much. It must be hard on you." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "It's challenging sometimes," I admitted, "but he works hard for us." Nathan nodded, his gaze steady. "Still, you deserve more than just being left behind." His words hung in the air, heavy with implications I wasn't ready to confront. I forced a smile, hoping to lighten the mood. "You've been a huge help today. Maybe I should hire you as my personal assistant." He laughed, the tension breaking. "Ah, I'd need a better paycheck than that." The evening came quietly, with dinner and a shared movie in the dimly lit living room. We sat at opposite ends of the couch, but the closeness felt intimate nonetheless. I found myself watching him more than the screen, noticing details I hadn't before. The way his jawline had sharpened with age, the warmth in his smile. I quickly looked away, scolding myself for the thoughts creeping into my mind. This was Nathan, my stepson, a part of my family. Anything more was unthinkable. But as the credits rolled and he turned to me, his eyes lingering a moment too long, I realized I wasn't the only one battling unspoken thoughts. I looked around the room and saw the exact same face as before. "I'm glad you're here," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that made my pulse quicken. "Me too," I replied, my voice barely audible. For a moment, the space between us seemed to shrink, the air thick with tension. Then, as if sensing the precariousness of the moment, Nathan stood abruptly, stretching and yawning. "I think I'll head to bed," he said, his tone casual again. "Good night," I managed, my heart racing as he disappeared down the hallway. Alone in the living room, I sat in silence, the weight of the day settling over me. I told myself it was nothing, just a fleeting moment born of loneliness and misplaced affection. But deep down, I knew something had shifted, and I wasn't sure if I could ever go back to the way things were. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as the events of the day replayed in my mind. Every glance, every word, every small moment felt magnified in the stillness of the dark. I could hear Nathan moving around in his room, the faint creak of floorboards as he settled for the night. Each sound sent a ripple through my thoughts, stirring emotions I didn't want to name. This was wrong, I knew it was. But the loneliness I'd been battling for so long had become a void, and today it had felt, for the first time in years, as though someone had noticed me. The following morning was quiet. I woke up early, trying to shake off the weight of my thoughts. By the time Nathan emerged from his room, I had already brewed coffee and started breakfast. He walked into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, his hair a mess. "Morning," he said, his voice still heavy with sleep. "Morning," I replied, keeping my tone light as I poured him a cup of coffee. "Toast or eggs?" "Toast's fine," he said, sitting at the counter. His eyes lingered on me briefly before looking away, and I felt the same uneasy pull from the day before. As the day went on, I tried to keep myself busy. Nathan had plans to meet some friends later in the afternoon, which gave me a much-needed break to collect my thoughts. Yet, as I cleaned the house and folded laundry, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at me over breakfast. Soft, almost longing, as if searching for something I wasn't sure I could give. By the time he left to see his friends, the house felt hollow. I busied myself with small tasks, anything to fill the silence. When he returned a few hours later, I was in the garden, pruning roses. "You've been out here all day?" he asked, leaning against the porch railing. There was an ease to his posture that reminded me of Dan when we first met, confident but not overbearing. "Not all day," I said with a faint smile, brushing dirt from my hands. "Just trying to keep these alive." Nathan stepped down into the yard, walking over to inspect my work. "Looks like you've done a good job." I laughed. "You're just saying that because you don't know the first thing about gardening." He grinned. "Maybe, but they look nice to me." We fell into a comfortable silence, the sound of birds chirping and the faint hum of traffic filling the air. As I stood there, watching him inspect the roses with surprising care, I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite place. Pride, maybe, or affection. But underneath it was something far more dangerous. a yearning I couldn't ignore. "Do you want to help?" I asked, breaking the silence. "Sure," he said, his grin widening. "What do I do?" I handed him a pair of gloves and shears, showing him how to trim the stems just above the nodes. As he worked beside me, his focus evident, I felt the tension between us ease. For a while it was just the two of us, working in unspoken harmony. "You're a natural," I said after a while, watching as he carefully clipped a branch. He glanced at me, his expression soft. Maybe I just have a good teacher. The warmth in his voice caught me off guard, and I turned away quickly, pretending to inspect another rosebush. The moment passed, but the weight of it lingered, following us back into the house as the sun began to set. That evening, we decided to order pizza and watch a movie, a tradition we'd fallen into during Dan's long absences. We chose an old comedy, something light-hearted to fill the quiet. But as the movie played, I found myself glancing at Nathan more than the screen. His laughter was infectious, and the way his eyes lit up reminded me of the boy he used to be before life had made him guarded. At one point, I reached for the popcorn bowl at the same time he did, our hands brushing. It was a small thing, barely worth noticing, but the electricity in that brief touch sent a jolt through me. I quickly pulled my hand back, my face flushing. "Sorry," I muttered, my eyes fixed on the screen. "It's fine," he said, his voice soft. There was a pause before he added, "You don't have to be so nervous around me, you know." His words hung in the air, and I didn't know how to respond. Nervous? Was I being that obvious? "I'm not nervous," I said, finally forcing a laugh. "Why would I be?" He didn't answer right away, his gaze lingering on me for a moment before he looked back at the screen. "I don't know. Just feels like you're always holding back." The comment stung, not because it wasn't true, but because it was. I had been holding back, pushing down feelings I didn't want to admit even existed. But hearing him say it so plainly brought everything to the surface. I stood abruptly, picking up the empty pizza box. "I'm going to clean up," I said, avoiding his gaze. "Need help?" he asked, his tone neutral but his eyes following me. "No, I've got it," I said quickly, retreating to the kitchen. As I washed the dishes, I tried to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside me. This was getting out of hand. I needed to draw a line, to remind myself and him of the boundaries that couldn't be crossed. But as I turned off the faucet and looked up, I saw Nathan leaning against the doorway, watching me. There was something in his expression I couldn't read, something vulnerable yet resolute. "We need to talk," he said softly. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the sink as Nathan's words hung in the air. My mind raced with excuses to avoid this conversation, to delay whatever it was he felt the need to say. But when I turned around, the look on his face, calm but resolute, made it clear he wouldn't let this go. "What is it, Nathan?" I asked, my voice steady despite the unease swirling inside me. He stepped further into the kitchen, leaning against the counter as his eyes searched mine. "I've been meaning to say something for a while now, but..." I didn't know how. A lump formed in my throat as I forced myself to meet his gaze. "Go on." He hesitated, running a hand through his hair, a nervous habit I'd seen many times before. But this wasn't the same Nathan who'd sheepishly asked for help with homework or hesitated before borrowing the car keys. There was an intensity to him now, a quiet confidence that unnerved me. "You're not happy, are you?" he asked softly, his words hitting me like a gust of wind. The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to deny it, to brush it off with a polite smile, but the sincerity in his expression made it impossible to lie. "What makes you say that?" Nathan sighed, crossing his arms as he leaned back against the counter. I see how you look when Dad's not here. How much you do to keep things running, to keep everything together. But it's like there's a part of you that's always somewhere else. Somewhere he doesn't notice. I swallowed hard, feeling exposed under the weight of his words. He wasn't wrong. I had spent years trying to hold everything together, hiding my loneliness behind a mask of routine and self-reliance. But hearing it laid bare by Nathan, of all people, was almost too much. "I'm fine," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. "Marriage isn't always easy, Nathan, but your dad and I—" "Don't tell me it's fine," he interrupted gently but firmly. "I know what fine looks like. This isn't it." The room felt unbearably still as his words settled between us. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. He wasn't a child anymore, someone I could pacify with half-truths or platitudes. He saw through me in a way that no one else had, not even Dan. "Nathan, you shouldn't," I began, but he cut me off again, stepping closer. "I care about you," he said, his voice low but earnest. "And I see you. I see how much you've sacrificed, how much you've been left alone. You deserve more than that." His words, spoken with such conviction, sent a shiver down my spine. I looked away, trying to hide the tears welling in my eyes. "You shouldn't say things like that," I murmured. "It's not fair." "Why not?" he asked, his tone softening. "It's the truth." I shook my head, willing myself to regain control of the situation. "Because it's not your place, Nathan. I'm your stepmother. This isn't a conversation we should be having." Nathan sighed, running a hand through his hair again as he stepped back. "Maybe it's not, but it doesn't change how I feel." The air between us felt heavy, charged with emotions neither of us knew how to handle. I wanted to say something, to put an end to this before it spiraled further, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood frozen, caught between the boundaries I knew we couldn't cross and the undeniable connection simmering beneath the surface. Finally, Nathan broke the silence. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice filled with genuine regret. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you." I shook my head, finding my voice at last. "It's not your fault, Nathan. We've both been through a lot, but we need to be careful, for your dad's sake, for both of us." He nodded, his expression conflicted. "I understand." With that, he turned and left the kitchen, leaving me alone with the thoughts I had been trying so desperately to ignore. The next few days passed in a blur of avoidance. Nathan kept his distance, retreating to his room or leaving the house for hours at a time. I busied myself with errands and chores, anything to distract me from the tension that now lingered between us. But no matter how hard I tried to push it aside, I couldn't stop replaying our conversation in my mind. His words, his sincerity, his concern. They had struck a chord I couldn't ignore. For so long I had felt invisible, an afterthought in my own home. But Nathan had seen me, really seen me, in a way that both terrified and comforted me. One evening, as I folded laundry in the living room, Nathan appeared in the doorway, his expression hesitant. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice tentative. I hesitated, my hand pausing mid-fold, before nodding. "Of course." He sat down across from me, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I've been thinking about what I said the other night, and I want you to know that I didn't mean to overstep." I met his gaze, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "I know, and I appreciate your honesty, Nathan, but we need to keep things simple, for all of our sakes." He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I get it, but that doesn't mean I'm going to stop caring about you. You're important to me, and I just want you to be happy." His words, though well-meaning, stirred something deep within me, a longing I couldn't ignore. But I forced myself to smile, keeping my tone light. "Thank you, Nathan. That means a lot." He smiled faintly, the tension between us easing slightly. "Well, I'll let you get back to it," he said, standing and heading toward the stairs. As I watched him go, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. I knew he meant well, but the connection between us was something I couldn't afford to dwell on. It was too complicated, too dangerous. And yet, as the door to his room clicked shut, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The following day began like any other, but beneath the surface, I felt the lingering tension, like a thread that could unravel at any moment. Nathan stayed in his room for most of the morning, leaving me to quietly tend to household chores. I appreciated the space, using it to gather my thoughts and remind myself of the boundaries I needed to maintain. But by early afternoon, he emerged, his presence as unmistakable as ever. He found me in the backyard, crouched over a flower bed, pruning wilted blossoms under the bright sun. The weight of his gaze was almost tangible before I even looked up. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice casual but his posture tense. I straightened, brushing dirt off my gloves. "I think I've got it under control, but thanks." He stepped closer anyway, kneeling beside me and picking up the discarded pruning shears. "I could at least do this," he said, his tone light. It wasn't a question. It was a declaration, as if he'd already decided that he wouldn't leave me alone. I hesitated, then nodded. "Just clip the ones that look dead," I said, trying to focus on the task at hand. For a while, we worked in silence, the only sounds the snip of the shears and the occasional chirp of birds in the distance. It was oddly peaceful, the kind of quiet that didn't feel heavy or strained. Yet, as we worked side by side, I couldn't help but notice how natural it felt, how the air between us seemed to settle into a rhythm of its own. "You've got a knack for this," I said eventually, breaking the silence. Nathan glanced at me, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're just being nice." "No, really," I insisted. "I think you missed your calling as a gardener." He laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "I don't think Dad would be too thrilled if I ditched college for flowers." "True," I said, smiling despite myself. "But at least you've got a fallback plan." We fell back into a comfortable rhythm, the earlier tension between us easing into something softer, less charged. For a moment, it felt like everything might go back to normal, like we could bury the events of the past few days and move on. But then, as we finished the flower bed and stood side by side to admire our work, Nathan turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he began, his voice quieter now, "I think this is the most time we've ever spent together." I looked at him, startled by the sudden shift in tone. "Well, you've always been busy. School, friends, and you've always had Dad," he said, cutting me off gently. There was no malice in his words, only a quiet understanding that made my chest ache. I didn't know how to respond, so I didn't. Instead, I turned back to the flower bed, pretending to inspect the freshly pruned stems. "You don't have to say anything," he continued, his voice softer now. "I just wanted you to know. I'm glad we've had this time, even if it's not what either of us expected." The honesty in his words left me speechless. I felt a warmth rise in my chest, mingling with the guilt I had been carrying for days. This wasn't how things were supposed to be, but for reasons I couldn't explain, I didn't want it to end. "Thank you, Nathan," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. We stood there for a moment longer, the silence between us thick with unspoken truths. And then, as if sensing the need to step away, Nathan smiled faintly and headed back toward the house. "I'll grab us some water," he called over his shoulder. I watched him go, my heart heavy with emotions I couldn't untangle. This connection between us. It was dangerous, yes, but it was also undeniable. And as much as I wanted to push it away, I didn't know if I had the strength to. That evening, the house was quiet again, the weight of the day settling over us like a heavy blanket. Nathan had retreated to his room after dinner, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I tried to distract myself with a book, but the words blurred on the page, my mind drifting back to the way he'd looked at me earlier, the softness in his eyes, the unspoken care in his words. I didn't want to dwell on it, but I couldn't help it. For so long I had felt invisible, overlooked in a marriage that had grown stagnant with time. Dan wasn't a bad husband. He was kind, responsible, and hardworking. But his absence, both physical and emotional, had left a void I hadn't realized existed until Nathan filled it. And that was the heart of the problem. Nathan wasn't supposed to fill that void. He wasn't supposed to see me the way he did, and I wasn't supposed to feel this way in return. But knowing that didn't make it any easier to stop. The sound of footsteps on the stairs broke me out of my thoughts. I looked up to see Nathan standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, closing my book. He shook his head, stepping into the living room. "No, just thinking." I nodded, motioning for him to sit. He hesitated for a moment before taking the seat across from me, his posture tense. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice cautious. He looked at me, his gaze steady. "I just wanted to say, I don't want to make things harder for you." "You're not," I said quickly, though I wasn't sure if it was true. "I think I am," he countered, his voice quiet but firm. "And I don't want to. You've been through enough without me making things more complicated." I swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. "Nathan, you're not—" "I am," he interrupted, his tone gentle but insistent. "And I'm sorry. I don't know what's going on with me, but I don't want to ruin things for you." The raw honesty in his words left me reeling. For a moment, all I could do was stare at him, my chest tightening with emotions I couldn't name. "You're not ruining anything," I said finally, my voice trembling. "We've both been under a lot of stress, that's all. It'll get better." He nodded slowly, though his expression didn't lighten. "I hope so." We sat in silence for a moment longer before Nathan stood, offering me a faint smile. "Good night," he said softly. "Good night," I replied, watching as he disappeared up the stairs. As the sound of his footsteps faded, I leaned back against the couch, my heart heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. I knew we were teetering on a line we couldn't afford to cross, but for the first time in years I felt seen. And I wasn't sure if I could let that go. The days that followed were a careful dance of avoidance and subtle reconciliation. Nathan kept himself busy with errands and projects around the house, and I did the same. While our interactions were polite and casual, the weight of what had been said between us lingered in the air, a quiet presence neither of us could ignore. I told myself this was a good thing. Distance was what we needed, what I needed to gain clarity. Yet, each time our paths crossed, a spark of something unspoken flickered, reminding me that distance was easier said than done. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, Nathan walked in. He had been out for most of the day, and the slight flush on his cheeks suggested he'd been working outside. "Smells good," he said, leaning against the counter. "Thanks," I replied, keeping my focus on the cutting board. "Just something simple tonight, pasta and salad." He nodded, watching me as I worked. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged, like the pause before a storm. I could feel his gaze on me, and despite my best efforts, my pulse quickened. "Need any help?" he asked, his tone casual. No, I've got it," I said quickly, though a part of me wished he would stay. "Why don't you take a break? You've been busy all day." He hesitated, then moved closer instead of stepping away. "I don't mind helping," he said softly, his voice carrying an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite place. I turned to look at him, a response on the tip of my tongue, but the intensity in his eyes stole the words from me. For a moment, the world around us seemed to fade, leaving only the quiet thrum of my heartbeat and the unspoken tension between us. "Nathan," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. He stepped back suddenly, as if realizing the weight of the moment. "Sorry," he said quickly, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't mean to—" "It's okay," I interrupted, forcing a smile. "Really?" He nodded, but his expression was conflicted. "I'll set the table," he said, grabbing plates and cutlery from the cabinet before I could protest. As he moved around the kitchen, I tried to steady myself, focusing on the task at hand, but the knot in my chest refused to loosen, and I couldn't ignore the way his presence filled the room. Later that night, after we had eaten and cleaned up, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, the soft glow of the table lamp casting long shadows across the walls. Nathan had retreated to his room after dinner, and I had convinced myself that the quiet was exactly what I needed. But as I sat there, staring at the blank screen of the television, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was unresolved. I told myself to leave it, to let the tension between us settle naturally. But before I could stop myself, I found my feet carrying me toward his room. I knocked softly, half hoping he wouldn't hear, but the door opened almost immediately. Nathan stood there, his expression a mix of surprise and curiosity. "Hey," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "Hi," I said, suddenly unsure of why I was there. "I just wanted to check on you. You seemed quiet at dinner." He smiled faintly, closing the door behind me. "I'm fine. Just had a lot on my mind." I nodded, sitting on the edge of his bed while he leaned against his desk. The room felt smaller with the two of us in it, the air thick with unspoken thought. "Nathan," I began, searching for the right words. "I know things have been complicated lately, and I just want you to know that I don't want this to affect us, to affect our relationship." He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. "It already has," he said quietly, "but I don't think that's a bad thing." His words took me by surprise, and I struggled to find a response. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he paused, running a hand through his hair. "I think we've been avoiding a lot of things. You, me, Dad. None of us are really dealing with what's going on." I looked down at my hands, his words hitting closer to home than I wanted to admit. "Maybe you're right," I said finally, "but that doesn't mean we can't fix it." He nodded slowly, but his gaze didn't waver. "I just don't want to see you unhappy." His sincerity brought tears to my eyes, and I looked away, ashamed of the emotions bubbling to the surface. "You don't have to worry about me, Nathan. I'll be fine." "But I do worry," he said, his voice firm but gentle, "because you're important to me, and I don't want you to feel like you're alone." His words broke something inside me, and before I could stop myself, I reached for his hand. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. He squeezed my hand gently, his touch warm and steady. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I just want you to know I'm here for you. Always." For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of his words settling over us like a heavy blanket. I knew we were treading dangerous ground, but I couldn't bring myself to pull away. His presence, his care, it was everything I hadn't realized I needed. But as the seconds stretched into minutes, I forced myself to let go, to step back before the line between us blurred any further. I should go, I said softly, standing and smoothing my hands over my skirt. Nathan nodded, his expression calm but conflicted. "Good night," he said, his voice quiet. "Good night," I replied, my heart heavy as I left the room. As I closed the door behind me, I leaned against it, my breath shaky and uneven. I knew we couldn't keep going like this, but I didn't know how to stop. And deep down, I wasn't sure if I wanted to. The next morning, the air felt lighter somehow, though the tension between Nathan and me still lingered beneath the surface. I found solace in the quiet hum of routine. Laundry, tidying the living room, organizing the kitchen pantry. It gave me something to focus on, something to occupy my mind. Nathan emerged from his room mid-morning, looking rested and relaxed. He greeted me with a warm "morning," and I replied in kind, relieved that our conversation the previous night hadn't created a deeper rift between us. "I was thinking of heading out to the hardware store," he said, leaning against the kitchen counter as I prepared coffee. "There's a busted hinge on the shed door that's been bothering me. Thought I'd fix it while I have the time." "That's thoughtful of you," I said, smiling. "I'm sure your dad will appreciate it." He shrugged. "Might as well keep busy," and handed him a mug of coffee, our fingers brushing as he took it. It was such a simple gesture, yet it sent a jolt through me, a reminder of how easily the line between us could blur. I quickly pulled my hand back and busied myself with wiping down the counter. "If you need anything else from the store, let me know," he said, his voice casual but warm. "I'll check," I replied, keeping my tone light. "Thank you." He nodded and turned to leave, pausing briefly in the doorway. "You know, you don't always have to be the one holding everything together," he said, glancing back at me. Now, his words caught me off guard, but before I could respond, he was gone, leaving me alone with my thoughts. It wasn't the first time he'd said something like that, his way of reminding me that I didn't have to shoulder everything on my own. But today it hit differently. It felt less like an observation and more like an invitation to let go, to allow myself to be seen. The rest of the day passed quietly. Nathan returned from the hardware store in the afternoon and spent the next few hours working on the shed. I watched him from the kitchen window as he moved with ease and confidence, his focus unwavering. There was something soothing about seeing him so at home, so comfortable in his own skin. By early evening, the shed was fixed, and Nathan came inside, his shirt damp with sweat and his hair tousled from the summer heat. He grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and leaned against the counter, his breathing steady but labored. "Job well done?" I asked, smiling as I set the table for dinner. He said, grinning, "The door's good as new." "Thank you for doing that," I said sincerely. "It's been on the to-do list for ages." "No problem," he said, taking a long sip of water. "Figured it was time someone got to it." We fell into an easy rhythm as we prepared dinner together, the familiar motions of chopping vegetables and stirring sauces filling the silence. It felt normal, comfortable, like we'd slipped back into the natural flow of our relationship. But as the evening wore on and the shadows grew longer, that quiet tension returned, creeping into the spaces between our words. After dinner, we sat in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting a warm light over the room. Nathan had pulled out a deck of cards, challenging me to a game of rummy. "You sure you're ready for this?" I teased as I shuffled the deck. "Absolutely," he said, smirking. "I've been practicing." "Oh, have you now?" I said, raising an eyebrow. "Well, don't say I didn't warn you." The game started with laughter and light-hearted banter, the kind of easy connection that had always defined our best moments. But as the rounds went on, the humor gave way to quieter conversations, our words growing softer and more reflective. "You're really good at this," he said, watching as I laid down a winning hand. "I've had years of practice," I replied with a grin. "Your dad and I used to play all the time." His smile faltered slightly, and he leaned back in his chair, studying me. "Do you miss it, the way things used to be?" The question caught me off guard, and I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "I miss some things," I admitted, "but life changes, people change. It's just part of growing together." Nathan nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "But what if one person changes more than the other?" I looked at him, my chest tightening at the weight of his words. "Sometimes that happens," I said carefully, "but it doesn't mean you stop trying." He held my gaze for a moment longer before looking away, his expression conflicted. "I guess." The room fell into a heavy silence, the game forgotten as we both sat lost in our thoughts. Finally, I cleared my throat and stood, gathering the cards. "I think that's enough for tonight," I said, forcing a smile. He said softly, watching me as I moved to put the deck away. "Probably." As I turned to leave the room, I felt his hand brush against mine, stopping me in my tracks. I glanced down to see him holding one of the cards I'd missed, his fingers grazing mine as he handed it over. "Good night," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "Good night," I replied, my heart racing as I walked away. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the evening in my mind. The quiet moments, the unspoken words, the way his hand had lingered just a second too long. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew better. Nathan wasn't just my stepson anymore. He had become a presence in my life that I couldn't ignore, a force that challenged everything I thought I knew about myself and my marriage. And as much as I wanted to push him away, to restore the boundaries we had so carefully maintained, I couldn't deny the connection that had grown between us. I didn't know where this path would lead, but I knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same. The next day started with an air of normalcy, though the tension between Nathan and me still simmered beneath the surface. I kept myself busy in the garden, pruning the roses and pulling weeds, hoping the physical activity would distract me from the whirlwind of emotions that had been building over the past few days. But even as I worked, my thoughts kept drifting back to him, to the moments we'd shared, the conversations that had lingered long after the words had been spoken. Nathan appeared mid-morning, his usual easy-going demeanor replaced by something more serious. He walked over to the garden, hands shoved into his pockets, and watched me work for a moment before speaking. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice soft. I glanced up at him, shielding my eyes from the sun. "I think I've got it, but thanks." He didn't move, lingering at the edge of the garden as if waiting for an invitation. Finally, I sighed and set down my pruning shears. "You can water the beds if you want," I said, gesturing toward the hose. He nodded, grabbing the hose and turning on the water. As he worked, the silence between us felt heavier than usual, filled with unspoken words that neither of us seemed brave enough to say. "I've been thinking about what you said the other night," I said, eventually breaking the silence, "about me always holding everything together." Nathan glanced at me, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, you're not wrong," I admitted, brushing dirt from my gloves. "It's hard not to, especially when Dan's gone so much, but it's not your job to worry about me." He turned off the hose, setting it down before walking over to where I stood. "Maybe it's not my job," he said, his voice steady, "but I can't help it. I care about you." His words sent a shiver through me, and I looked away, focusing on the flowers at my feet. "Nathan, I appreciate that. I really do. But you shouldn't feel like you have to take on that responsibility." "I'm not trying to take on anything," he said, his tone soft but firm. "I just don't want you to feel like you're alone." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over me. For so long I had felt exactly that, alone. Even with Dan, even with a house full of memories, the emptiness had become a constant companion. And now, here was Nathan, seeing me in a way that no one else had, offering a connection that I wasn't sure I deserved. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled faintly, his gaze warm and steady. "You don't have to thank me." For a moment, the world around us seemed to fade, leaving only the quiet thrum of my heartbeat and the intensity of his gaze. But before the moment could linger, I turned away, picking up my tools and brushing past him. "I should get back to work," I said quickly, my voice betraying the nervous energy bubbling inside me. Nathan nodded, stepping aside to let me pass. "I'll be inside if you need me," he said, his tone neutral but laced with something I couldn't quite place. By the time the sun began to set, the tension between us had settled into an uneasy truce. We spent the evening in the living room, the television on but neither of us truly watching. The quiet between us was comfortable but charged, like the calm before a storm. As the credits rolled on a movie I couldn't even remember starting, Nathan turned to me, his expression serious. "Can I ask you something?" I hesitated, unsure of where this was going, but nodded. "Of course." "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice quiet but direct. The question took me by surprise, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. "What do you mean?" I asked, stalling for time. "In your marriage," he clarified, "with Dad. Are you happy?" I opened my mouth to answer, but the words caught in my throat. Was I happy? The question seemed so simple, yet the answer was anything but. I loved Dan, of course, but the loneliness and distance between us had taken a toll I wasn't sure we could repair. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice trembling. "Marriage is complicated, Nathan. It's not always about happiness." He frowned, his brow furrowing as he leaned forward. "But it should be. You deserve to be happy." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and I felt my chest tighten under the weight of his gaze. "Nathan, this isn't something we should be talking about." "Why not?" he asked, his tone gentle but insistent. "Because it's the truth?" "Because it's not your place," I said firmly, though my voice wavered. "You're my stepson. This isn't something you should be worrying about." He sighed, leaning back against the couch. "I can't help it," he admitted. "You mean a lot to me, and I hate seeing you like this." His honesty was both disarming and overwhelming, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I quickly blinked them away, refusing to let him see how much his words had affected me. "I appreciate that," I said softly. "But you have to trust me to figure this out on my own." He nodded slowly, though his expression remained conflicted. "Okay," he said finally. "But if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The conversation left me reeling, and I excused myself soon after, retreating to my bedroom to gather my thoughts. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were teetering on the edge of something we couldn't take back. The following morning dawned with a quiet stillness, as though the house itself had settled into an uneasy peace. I lingered in bed longer than usual, the weight of my thoughts pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. I told myself that today would be different, that I would create the distance we both needed to restore some semblance of normalcy. But when I stepped into the kitchen, there he was. Nathan stood at the counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He looked up as I entered, his expression softening into a smile. "Morning," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "Morning," I replied, forcing a casual tone as I moved toward the coffee pot. We stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the faint clink of spoons against ceramic. I could feel his eyes on me, but I kept my focus on stirring my coffee, hoping the quiet would dissipate the tension between us. "I was thinking of heading out for a hike later," he said, breaking the silence. "Clear my head a bit." "That sounds nice," I said, grateful for the suggestion of distance. "It's a good day for it." "You should come," he added, catching me off guard. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the counter. "I don't know," I said carefully. "I've got some things to do around the house." "It can wait," he said, his tone gentle but insistent. "You deserve a break." The sincerity in his voice made it hard to refuse, but I knew I had to. "I appreciate the offer, but I think I'll pass," I said, offering a polite smile. Nathan studied me for a moment before nodding. "Okay," he said, his tone light. "Maybe another time." As he left the kitchen, I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I told myself I'd done the right thing, that creating space was the only way to untangle the growing web of emotions between us. But as I watched him leave, a pang of guilt and longing twisted in my chest. The hours passed slowly after Nathan left for his hike. I tried to distract myself with cleaning and organizing, but every quiet moment felt like an invitation for my thoughts to spiral. I couldn't stop replaying our conversations, the way his words had lingered in my mind long after they'd been spoken. When he returned in the late afternoon, his face flushed from the sun and his shirt damp with sweat, I felt the tension settle back into the air like a storm cloud. "Good hike?" I asked as he stepped into the kitchen, reaching for a glass of water. "Yeah," he said, his tone casual. "It was nice to get out for a bit." "Good," I said, offering a small smile. "You look like you worked up a sweat." He chuckled, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. It was worth it. The silence that followed felt heavy, and I searched for something, anything, to break it. "I was thinking of making lasagna for dinner," I said, grasping at small talk. "Sound good?" "Sounds great," he said, his smile warming the space between us. "Need any help?" "I think I've got it," I said quickly, though I could feel my resolve wavering under his gaze. "All right," he said, stepping away from the counter. "Let me know if you change your mind." As he left the room, I let out a quiet sigh, the knot in my chest loosening slightly. But even as I prepared dinner, the weight of his presence lingered, a constant reminder of how precarious things had become. That evening, as we sat down to eat, the tension between us felt almost tangible. We talked about simple things, his hike, the garden, a show we'd both been watching, but the words felt hollow, like we were both avoiding the larger conversation looming over us. As we finished dinner, Nathan leaned back in his chair, studying me with an intensity that made my heart race. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his tone careful. I hesitated, my hand stilling over my plate. "Of course." "Do you ever wonder what life would be like if things were different?" he asked, his voice quiet. The question caught me off guard, and I struggled to find an answer. Different how?" I asked, stalling for time. "Just different," he said, his gaze unwavering. "If things hadn't turned out the way they did, if we'd met under different circumstances. His words sent a shiver through me, and I looked away, focusing on the table instead of his eyes. "Nathan, you shouldn't." "I know," he said, cutting me off gently. "I know I shouldn't, but I can't help it." The raw honesty in his voice left me speechless, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "This isn't fair," I said finally, my voice trembling. "To me, to you, to your dad? I know it's not," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But that doesn't change how I feel." His words hung in the air, and I felt my resolve crumbling under the weight of his gaze. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that we could never cross the line that separated us, but the truth was, a part of me didn't want to. "We can't do this, Nathan," I said, forcing the words out even as my chest tightened. "It's not right." "I know," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper, "but that doesn't make it any easier." For a moment, the room was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background. I wanted to leave, to put an end to the conversation before it spiraled further, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Finally, Nathan stood, his expression conflicted. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I didn't mean to make this harder for you." "It's not your fault," I said, my voice shaking. "We've both been through a lot, but we need to figure out a way to move past this." He nodded slowly, though his eyes remained locked on mine. "I'll do whatever you need me to." "Thank you," I said, the words barely audible. As he left the room, I felt a mix of relief and sorrow, the weight of the unspoken settling over me like a heavy blanket. I didn't know how we were going to move forward, but I knew one thing for certain: we couldn't stay here, caught in the in-between, for much longer. So the days that followed felt like a fragile balancing act, each moment teetering on the edge of what was safe and what was not. Nathan and I avoided the heavy conversations, slipping back into the rhythm of small talk and shared chores. But even in the quietest moments, the tension between us hummed, an ever-present undercurrent we couldn't ignore. One evening, after a long day spent cleaning the garage, Nathan suggested we have a barbecue in the backyard. It seemed harmless, even cheerful, a way to break the monotony and create some distance from the heaviness that had lingered for weeks. I agreed, grateful for the distraction. By the time the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the backyard, the grill was fired up and the air smelled of sizzling burgers. Nathan stood at the grill, flipping patties with an ease that made me smile. I set the table on the patio, lighting a few candles as dusk settled in. "This is nice," I said as I poured us each a glass of iced tea. "Feels good to relax for a change." Nathan smiled, his face soft in the warm glow of the candles. "Yeah, it does. Thanks for going along with it." As we ate, the conversation flowed easily, the weight of the past few weeks lifting slightly. We talked about everything and nothing. His plans for the summer, my favorite recipes, the garden we'd been working on together. For a little while, it felt like the tension between us had faded, replaced by something softer, more comfortable. But as the meal wound down and the stars began to dot the night sky, the quiet between us returned. Nathan leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting upward. "You ever just look at the stars and wonder?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Wonder about what?" I asked, setting down my glass. "Everything," he said, his eyes still fixed on the sky. "Life, choices, what could have been?" His words sent a ripple through me, and I looked away, focusing on the flickering candlelight instead. "I try not to dwell on the past too much," I said carefully. "It doesn't change anything." "No, but it helps you understand." he said, glancing at me. And sometimes it helps you figure out what you really want. The intensity in his gaze made my chest tighten, and I quickly looked down at my hands, twisting my fingers together. Nathan, I'm not trying to make things harder, he said softly, cutting me off. I can't stop thinking about how much you've given up, how much you've sacrificed, and I keep wondering if anyone's ever really seen you for who you are. His words left me breathless, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. You don't know what you're saying, I said, my voice trembling. This isn't fair. To me, to you, to your dad. I know it's not, he said, his tone firm but gentle. But it's the truth. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the patio as I pushed it back. I think we've both had enough for one night, I said, my voice sharper than I intended, squaring my shoulders. Nathan stood too, his expression conflicted. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I didn't mean to upset you. Please. I know, I said, my voice softening, but it has to stop. He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the ground. I understand. As I walked back into the house, the weight of the evening pressed down on me like a heavy fog. I told myself I had done the right thing, that creating distance was the only way to protect us both. But deep down, I knew the line between us had already blurred, and there was no going back to the way things were. The next morning, I woke to find a note on the kitchen counter in Nathan's handwriting. Went out for the day, needed some space. Be back later. I stared at the note for a long time, a mix of relief and unease swirling in my chest. I had wanted distance, and now I had it. But the house felt emptier without him, and the silence was deafening. I spent the day in a haze, trying to keep myself busy with errands and chores, but no matter how much I tried to distract myself, my thoughts kept drifting back to Nathan, his words, his gaze, the way he had looked at me last night under the stars. By the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. I curled up on the couch with a book, hoping to lose myself in someone else's story for a while, but the sound of the front door opening jolted me out of my thoughts. Nathan stepped inside, his face flushed from the evening air. He paused when he saw me, his expression unreadable. Hey, he said softly. Hey, I replied, closing my book. Did you have a good day? He nodded, setting down his keys. Yeah, just needed to clear my head. I understand, I said, my voice careful. He hesitated for a moment before walking over to the couch, sitting down at the opposite end. The space between us felt vast, and yet the air was thick with unspoken words. I don't want things to be weird between us, he said after a long silence. Neither do I said, my voice soft. But we need to figure out how to move past this, for both our sake. He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. I know. And I'll do whatever it takes to make that happen. His words were sincere, and I felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to navigate this without breaking everything we'd built. Thank you, I said, meeting his gaze. That means a lot. For the first time in weeks, the tension between us seemed to ease, replaced by something quieter, more manageable. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. As the evening wore on, we slipped back into the familiar rhythm of small talk and shared laughter. And though the path ahead was still uncertain, I felt a glimmer of hope that we might find our way back to solid ground. The final week before Dan was set to return passed in a blur of careful interactions and uneasy calm. Nathan and I worked hard to maintain a sense of normalcy, filling the house with lighthearted conversations and shared tasks. as if we could erase the tension that had lingered for weeks. But beneath the surface, I felt the weight of everything that had passed between us, a quiet storm that hadn't yet dissipated. Dan's arrival loomed like a marker on the horizon, a reminder that life would soon shift back into its usual rhythm, or at least the version of it I had convinced myself was normal. I told myself that his return would fix things, would force Nathan and me to return to our respective roles and leave behind whatever fragile connection had grown between us. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The night before Dan was set to arrive, Nathan and I found ourselves in the living room, the quiet hum of the television filling the space. It was one of those rare moments where the tension between us seemed to have eased, replaced by something softer, almost melancholic. "Are you excited for Dad to come home?" Nathan asked, his voice casual but laced with something deeper. "Of course," I replied, though my answer felt automatic. "It'll be nice to have him back." Nathan nodded, his gaze fixed on the television. "It'll be good to have things go back to normal." The way he said it made my chest tighten, as though he were bracing himself for something he couldn't quite articulate. I wanted to reassure him, to tell him that everything would be fine, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I sat there in silence, the weight of the unspoken filling the room. The next morning was a flurry of activity as I prepared for Dan's arrival. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, double-checking every detail to ensure everything was perfect. Nathan helped, moving quietly from room to room, his presence a steadying force amid my nervous energy. By the time Dan's car pulled into the driveway, my heart was racing, a mixture of relief and trepidation coursing through me. I stood at the door, waiting as he stepped out of the car and walked toward the house, his suitcase in hand. "Welcome home," I said, forcing a smile as he stepped inside. Dan smiled back, wrapping me in a quick hug before turning to Nathan. "Hey kid," he said, clapping him on the shoulder. "How's everything been?" "Good," Nathan replied, his tone even. "Glad to have you back." As we settled into the evening, the house felt different, as though Dan's presence had shifted the energy. I told myself it was a good thing, that his return would restore balance and bring a sense of normalcy. But as I watched Nathan interact with his father, a quiet sadness settled over me, a realization that the connection we had shared was slipping away. That night, after Dan had gone to bed, I found Nathan sitting in the backyard, the glow of the porch light casting soft shadows across his face. He looked up as I stepped outside, his expression calm but distant. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, sitting down beside him. He shook his head. "Just needed some air." We sat in silence for a moment, the cool night air wrapping around us like a blanket. I wanted to say something to address the unspoken tension between us, but the words wouldn't come. "I just wanted to say thank you," Nathan said, finally breaking the silence, "for everything." His words took me by surprise, and I turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" "For being there," he said, his gaze steady. "For listening, for caring. It means more than you know." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I quickly looked away, afraid he would see. "You don't have to thank me, Nathan," I said softly. "I care about you. I always will." The quiet that followed felt heavy, filled with all the things we couldn't say. Finally, Nathan stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "I should head to bed," he said, his voice low. "Good night." "Good night," I replied, watching as he disappeared into the house. As the door clicked shut behind him, I leaned back in my chair, staring up at the stars. I knew this was the right thing, the only thing, but that didn't make it any easier. Over the next few days, life slowly began to settle back into its usual rhythm. Dan threw himself into work, and Nathan spent more time out of the house, reconnecting with friends and preparing for the upcoming semester. The tension that had defined the past few weeks began to fade, replaced by a quiet distance that felt both comforting and hollow. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, Nathan came in, his expression calm but serious. He sat down across from me, his gaze steady. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone careful, "about everything." I nodded, my heart racing as I waited for him to continue. "I think it's best if I head back to campus early," he said, his words measured. "Give us all some space." The decision felt like a blow and a relief all at once. I wanted to argue, to tell him he didn't need to leave, but I knew he was right. "Maybe that's for the best," I said, my voice soft. Nathan nodded, his expression unreadable. "I just want you to be happy. That's all that matters to me." Tears welled in my eyes and I quickly blinked them away. "Thank you, Nathan," I said, my voice trembling. "That means a lot." He offered a faint smile, standing as he placed a hand on my shoulder. "Take care of yourself, okay?" "You too," I replied, my voice barely audible. As he left the room, the weight of his absence settled over me like a heavy fog. I knew this was the right thing, the only way to move forward, but that didn't make the ache in my chest any less real. The next morning, I stood in the driveway as Nathan loaded his bags into his car. Dan had already left for work, and the house felt eerily quiet without him. "Drive safe," I said as Nathan climbed into the driver's seat. He nodded, his gaze lingering on mine for a moment before he started the car. "I'll see you soon." As he pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down the street, I felt a bittersweet mixture of relief and sadness. The house was quiet now, the storm that had lingered for weeks finally passing. But the echoes of what had happened remained, a reminder of the connection we'd shared and the boundaries we could never cross again. As I turned back toward the house, I felt a flicker of hope that with time we could both find our way forward, separately but stronger for the lessons we had learned.